I'm standing in what's now a beautiful museum in Valladolid in Spain. At one time, it was part of the university in this great city. And I'm here because we're filming for Bartolomé de las Casas, one of my pivotal players, maybe one of the lesser known of the pivotal players. But here he was engaged in a very important debate. And I'll get to that in a second, but I want to tell you a little bit about this figure because I think he's very important in the life of the church, but not sufficiently well known. Las Casas was born in 1484 in the town of Seville in southwestern Spain. His family was connected to Columbus's family. And it was in 1502, so just 10 years after Columbus's first voyage, that the very young Las Casas, only about 18, made his way to the New World. And there he was part of this whole, sort of Spanish establishment in the New World. Keep in mind, we're at the height of Spanish power and cultural influence. Las Casas, like all those that went over with Columbus, wanted to, find gold and riches and establish himself there. He returns a little bit later in his life, and it's especially at that time that he sees the brutal treatment of the native peoples. And this becomes the central theme, really, of Las Casas's life. It so appalled him that he wanted to do something about it. In time, he becomes a Dominican friar because he was so impressed by how the Dominicans had spoken out so clearly against this violation of the Christian spirit. Things get really interesting when Las Casas returns now as a Dominican friar to Spain. And he begins to engage first the king and his court to tell them stories about the native peoples and to urge them to treat them with dignity and with respect. Here in this place, he had this climactic debate with a man named Sepúlveda, who was a leading intellectual of the time. Sepúlveda was laying out the classic and widely accepted sort of Aristotelian argument that, certain people, because of a lack of intelligence or moral integrity, were destined for a life of servitude. And to put them in a position of authority or even to speak of their rights would be detrimental to them and to the wider society. Well, see, Las Casas was someone who knew the native peoples. He knew the Indians of the New World by direct experience. He knew that this was a very sort of condescending and patronizing characterization that they were by nature servile. And so he took up their cause here, you might say in the heart of civilized Europe, in the heart of Christendom. And his voice rang out in favor of the native peoples. It was not a popular point of view, either among the intellectuals or among the common people, and Las Casas was excoriated for most of this period of his life. He goes back to the New World. He's Bishop of Chiapas for a time in southern Mexico. His time there was not a happy one because the entire establishment stood against him. And he was never one to mince words. So Las Casas would boldly speak out against the establishment. In fact, in many cases, encouraging those in authority to release their slaves, and then he would refuse them the sacraments. Well, as you can guess, this did not make him a popular figure, and eventually he's basically chased out of Chiapas, returns to Spain, and takes up the same cause. It just strikes me that he's an important person in terms of the church's social justice tradition. Now, it stretches back to the Hebrew prophets, comes up through Jesus himself. Then look at the church fathers. People like Chrysostom and Ambrose of Milan, who were powerful advocates on behalf of the poor. And then it continues, late 19th into the 20th century, with the social encyclicals of the popes, beginning with Leo XIII, coming now right up through Pope Francis. But a key, I'd say, pivotal figure in this whole tradition is Bartolomé de las Casas, who in the 16th century, speaking out of a country at the height of its cultural influence and political power, speaks for the voiceless. Something I think really extraordinary too about Las Casas, almost unprecedented for his time, was his willingness to see things from the perspective of the other. Even going so far as to not so much make excuses for, but to try to understand the religious practices of the native peoples, including human sacrifice. Now, not that those arguments are very convincing in themselves, but they show this extraordinary willingness to enter into the perspective of the other. And this, I think, does make him an important precursor of the abolitionists, of the civil rights activists of the 1950s and 60s in our country. But anyone who, up and down the centuries, in the name of the gospel, has advocated for the voiceless. So maybe take some time to look up Bartolomé de las Casas, not a household name, not a figure that comes readily to mind, but someone that did indeed play a pivotal role in the development of the church's social teaching.